Okay, so today we're going to talk about measurement. Measurement really came from a need to communicate. Let's say that we're building something and we want to build the same thing. If we're working in the same shop together, we can either just go over and compare to make sure we get things the same size, or I can say, hey, it's this long or whatever, and you can cut it to the right size. But let's say you're working in a shop on the other side of the building or across town or whatever. There needs to be some way to communicate those measurements. Now, I could just cut something that length and send it over to you, but that gets to be kind of tedious and wasteful, especially if there's a whole bunch of measurements I need. It'd be really nice to be able to draw out a diagram of whatever it is and label them somehow with the measurements that are needed so that you don't have to compare to those pieces. So they needed some way to communicate. Now, what they could do, you maybe take something like this pen and say, okay, I'm going to go across the screen here. There's 1, 2, it's about 2.5 pens wide across the screen. While making two assumptions. One is that you have a pen. Two is that your pen is approximately the same size as mine. If that's your pen, well, our measurements are going to be very different because your pen's a lot bigger. 2.5 of this pen's way more than 2.5 of this pen. So they had to be very careful what they used. So what they did was they chose something that pretty much everybody had and were really close to the same size. They used body parts. For example, one of our smallest units of length in the standard measurement, of course this is the standard system, and it used to be called the English standard system, by the way, except for somewhere in the 1980s, England switched to the metric system. But anyway,
isn't America the only continent?
Yeah, right now, the United States is the only industrialized country that is not on the metric system. Yes. So we use the inch as our smallest unit of length measurement, or at least the smallest standard one that we use. The inch actually it is the distance from the end of the thumb to the point of the first knuckle. That's an inch.
Everybody?
Pretty much everybody is really close to the same. I mean, any adult. Now you got to remember one thing. Back when this was developed, not a sexist comment at all, it was the man's thumb that was used because the men were the one that did the actions at that time. So there is a significant difference between a male and a female thumb, but in general, from one man to the next, that was pretty close to the same. If you had the guy with the deformed thumbs, he probably got cheated a lot. But yeah, you go to measure. 1, 2. Notice that motion of measuring. You ever hear of an inchworm, by the way? That's where they got named, is that the inchworm has that kind of same motion when it moves like that, rolling the thumb like that. So that was an inch. Now, obviously, that's pretty small. If I wanted to measure something with any decent size to it, like even one of these tables in the room, that inch is too small. So what was the next biggest unit of measure that we know of? A foot. 1 foot, of course, now is approximately equal to 12 inches. And, of course, a foot is just that, the length from the tip of your big toe to the back of your heel. There are a lot of other units of measurement in between there, by the way. For example, if I wanted to measure the height of this wall, using my foot to measure the height of that wall is not very practical. Can anybody see why? Yeah, I'm not getting my leg all the way up there, am I? I'm not quite that flexible. So there were units, they used hands. A hand was, from the width of the hand here at the base of the fingers, from side of the palm to the other side of the palm. That was a hand. In fact, that's still used today to measure the height of livestock, stacking your hands. Any distance that was vertical, like a wall or anything like that, was measured in hands for height. A hand is approximately 4 inches. Now, somewhere around the 500s, King Edward declared that his thumb and his foot and his hand and everything were going to be the official units of the land. So they came in and they took pieces of wood or whatever and they marked the size of his thumb, the size of his foot, and they cut pieces and they passed them out for everybody to use. Well, now that they weren't actually using their foot, that they were using the standard piece to measure, now they could use a foot to measure the height of the wall. They didn't need the hand and some of the other units anymore. For construction, they had a unit called a cubit. Anybody hear the word cubit before?
Cubic?
Cubit. C-U-B-I-T. Cubit.
Never.
It was the distance from the point of your middle finger to the tip of your elbow. That was a cubit. That was actually stud spacing in a wall. If you measure that out, it's really close to 16 inches on most men. That's why most stud spacing is about 16 inches. Again, with standardizing the measurements, we don't need that so much anymore. In fact, there was for a long, long time no conversion between inches and feet and hands, because you think about it, there isn't exactly 12 of your thumbs in your foot. So after, and this is long after King Edward was dead, because heaven forbid they mess with the size of his foot, he would have had him beheaded. After King Edward passed away, they decided, hey, you know, if you measure something in feet and I measure it in inches, it would be really nice to be able to compare to see how close they are. So then they adjusted the length of the foot and the inch to make 12 inches in a foot. And likewise, they adjusted the foot and everything else to make everything fit. So we talked about the hand and the cubit. We're not really going to use those for anything, so you don't need to know those. Bigger than a foot we have, what's one that we use? The yard. Meters in the metric system. 1 yard is how many feet? 3 feet. A lot of people think of the yard as being the length of your stride, which is usually approximately a yard, but that's not where it came from. A yard is actually from the tip of your outstretched hand to either the point of your nose or the center of your chest, depending on who you're talking to. It was usually used for measuring fabric. They'd grab the fabric, they'd pull it out, they'd hold it to their chest. That was 1 yard. So that was a tailor's unit. It was close. Bigger than a yard, we have units like a fathom, which was originally the height of a man. It was used for navigation. A fathom was about the shallowest water that a boat could navigate through. Usually if a person stood in the water and their head stuck out of the water, it was usually too shallow for a boat to get through. Well, for your larger vessels, yes. They had furlongs, which we're not going to talk about. There is a unit we're going to talk about called a rod. 1 rod is about 5.5, we'll go 5.5 yards, or 16.5, we'll call it 16.5 feet. Where the rod came from. The rod was actually originally a shepherd's tool. A shepherd had 2 things. He had a rod and he had a staff. Now the staff was that old stereotypical little Bo Peep hook type thing. That was actually used for hooking sheep around the neck so you could get to them and check them out or shear them or whatever you need. It was used for catching a sheep. The rod was a long stick. Now you think of that, 16.5 feet. That's a pretty big stick. What they did was they'd literally take a sapling tree, they'd cut it off, and they'd debranch it. And that's what they used for a rod. It was a defensive weapon. You think about it, that's a big stick, but if you're like fighting off a wolf or something with nothing but a big stick, you do want a little distance between you and it, right? So it makes sense. How did the rod get used as a unit of measurement? Well, let's say Jason has some sheep and I have some sheep. We send them off to pasture, they go down in the valley, and at the end of the day, we need to get our sheep back. Jason says, well, I had 16 sheep, and I say, well, I had 18 sheep, and there's 24 sheep down there. Well, one or both of us is lying, aren't we? With cattle, how did they settle that argument?
Beat the piss out of each other.
They beat each other out? No, they used brands. They burnt their logo into the side of the cow. Real easy to see. Well, with sheep, there's a couple problems with that. One, what's that? Well, yeah, wool is a little bit flammable. Poof, yeah. Probably not a good idea. But also the wool on a sheep grows out too thick, so you really couldn't see the brand anyway. So it'd hide underneath the wool. And also the skin on a sheep isn't really as hardy as the skin on a cow. You burn right through it. They didn't really have ear tag technology back then. Now, that came about 100 years later. What's that? Put a necklace on them, put a chain around their neck. All that, though, required supplies that they didn't necessarily have. This was actually the beginning of land ownership and land surveying. What they would do is they'd find a landmark, like say this big rock on the hill. And they'd say, okay, you're going to pasture your sheep over here, and I'm going to pasture my sheep over here. We're going to divide up the land. What they would do is to make sure we got the same amount of land, I'll take my rod, I'm going to lay it on the ground here. You're going to take your rod, put it on the end and lay it down. Then we're going to flip-flop the rods, and we're going to measure, okay, it's 40 rods this way and 120 rods that way. We have the same amount of land. To this day, if you look at the legal description of a land survey, it'll still say that the corner of the property is 275 rods south of this landmark and 87 rods east or whatever. It's all done in rods. Bigger than a rod, like I said, we got furlongs and stuff like that. They're only used in horse and dog racing. We're going to jump up to a mile. Acre's not a unit of length, it's a unit of area. We'll talk about that in a day or two. A mile. It's okay, we still. A quarter mile. A mile is how many feet? Anybody know? 5,280. It's 1,760 yards. A mile was defined by the Roman military. A Roman soldier, one pace was starting on your left foot, going to your right foot, and back to your left foot. A mile was 1,000 paces of soldiers marching in formation. So that comes out to about 5,280 feet. So anyway, you can see that these are very cobbled together. In fact, there wasn't really any quality between the inches and feet and yards and rods and miles until hundreds of years into using them. They decided to make them, they put them together to make a system, and they adjusted the lengths. But you can see the numbers are still pretty awkward. To do conversions, excuse me. Let's say I have 6 feet and I'm going to convert it into inches. Well, most of you have probably done that conversion enough that you can tell me that that's just how much. 72. You know you just multiply by 12, right? But if you don't know that, if you don't remember that, you can do it this way. You've got the 6 feet. To do the conversion, do a formal conversion, we make it into a fraction. And now you're thinking, how does making anything into a fraction make it easier at all? Well, it does. I'll show you. We're getting rid of feet, so I'm going to put feet on bottom, inches on top, and 12 inches equals 1 foot. This thing right here is what we call a conversion factor. It's equal to 1 because 12 inches and 1 foot are the same value. So by multiplying by it, we don't change the value. We're just going to change the appearance. So the feet cancel out. 6 times 12 is 72 inches. 1 times 1 is 1. So 72 inches over 1 are just 72 inches. You're confused. It is, but what if it's a unit that you're not familiar with? Let's say we have 99 feet, and I want to convert it into rods. Well, that one we don't just know what to do because we haven't done that one that much. Okay? That is one thing you can do is if you're going from a small unit to a large unit, you know the number has to get small. If the unit's getting bigger, the number has to get smaller, just like scientific notation. So you know you're going to divide instead of multiply. But we're going to do this. 99 feet over 1. We're going to put feet on bottom because they need to cross cancel out. Rods on top. We know that 1 rod is 16.5 feet. So now we do the multiplication. 99 times 1 is 99 rods. 1 times 16.5 is 16.5. That divides out to give us 6 rods. What do you think? You could have just divided them, yes. I'm just throwing this out there because there are going to be some units we run into in the future that having this conversion factor is going to be nice to know. Like when we start talking about dual units, like converting pounds per square inch, or oh yeah, or slugs per cubic foot, or something like that. You'll do fine. Let's talk about the metric system. The metric system, believe it or not, how old do you think the metric system is? It actually is. Most people think it was developed in like the 1960s or 70s. It's pretty new. It was actually developed in the 1880s. It's been around for 150 years. Well, the thing about the metric system is, the standard system that we're used to was never planned out. It just kind of developed and it kind of got patched together to make a measurement system. So after struggling and having, hundreds, if not thousands of years of messing around with that standard system, they decided to create a system that was designed to work as a unified system instead of just a bunch of random things put together. So they designed the metric system to be easier to use. Now, most people I talk to hate the metric system because they're not used to it and they don't know it very well. But once you get to know it, it actually is a lot easier to use.
The metric system, because you go from standard to metric like it's nothing.
Yeah.
Like water pump I was changing on that Dodge, 6 of the 8 bolts are standard, then there was 2 metric ones in there.
And that's
For some stupid reason.
That's because some of the parts are produced in the United States and some are produced overseas. In fact, some of the engine block is assembled overseas before it comes to the United States for the final assembly. And that's actually very common. You get into stuff. That's why a lot of large corporations now have announced that they're going to, like IBM made the announcement about 3 years ago that everything they do is going to be done in the metric system.
I got a question for you. What
Sure.
is the meaning of the Latin root corpus?
Corpus?
Yeah.
Or corpe?
Corpus, C-O-R-P-U-S. Together, body, private person.
Huh, okay. I know carpe, but not corpe.
Alright, what's the one you know?
Carpe means to seize or to grab.
It was fine. Dang it.
Never seen it. I always use my metric socket instead of using the standard.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, there are a couple of them that make it. What is it? 12, the metric 12 and the 9/16, or is it the metric 13 and 9/16?
I believe it's 12.
I think it's the 12.
Don't they all, like,
Some of them are really sloppy if you try to put a metric socket on them.
you know, I use metric on my truck.
Yeah. But yeah, so like I said, IBM has made that announcement that everything they produce, even if it's produced in the United States, is going to be done in metric. They figure it's going to save them tens of millions of dollars a year, so that they don't have to produce all their parts. They don't have to design everything in both metric and standard and do the conversions and everything, because they send stuff out to be produced overseas and it's going to be produced in metric over there. So then they've got to do the conversion, and then they got to worry about whether the conversion is rounded off and whether it's going to fit or if it's going to be sloppy. So anyway, in the metric system, there's only one unit of length. It is called the meter. The meter is this thing right here.
Oh, that's what I was doing. Is that 4 feet?
This is actually about 3 feet, 3.5 inches.
Oh,
39.29 feet or something like that. Now, it would be really nice if this meter stick was 1 yard.
that's the same thing as a yardstick.
No, it's not. A yard is 36 inches. This is like 3.3 or 3.4 inches longer than a yardstick, which really sounds stupid, doesn't it? It would have made our life a lot easier if the meter was the same length as a yard and we could have gone from there. Well, that was one of the problems with the standard measuring system, is it wasn't standard. This was a yard in some countries before they made the switch. So the standard, what a yard was in the United States, was not the same as a yard in some other countries. Same with a pound. There was the imperial pound, there's the English pound, there's all sorts of, it was really weird. So anyway, the meter, abbreviated with just an M, is the only unit of length. Now, if they need to measure things smaller or larger, they used prefixes. Those prefixes would define a fraction of a meter or a multiple of a meter. For example, deci meant 1/10. So a decimeter was a tenth of a meter. Centi was 1/100th. So a centimeter was 100th of a meter, abbreviated cm. Milli was 1,000th. So mm or millimeter is 1,000th of a meter. Milli also comes from the Greek Roman military. Milli means 1,000. That's where the mile came from. Mile steps in formation, or mile pace, 1,000 paces in formation for a mile. After the millimeter, they don't go every 10 anymore. They start going every 1,000. So the next one is 1/1,000,000th, which is micro. Now they've already used mm for millimeter, so they use this letter. So the Greek letter mu for micro. Looks kind of like a U with a long tail, or a P that doesn't close on top, however you want to look at it. But if you're in the medical fields, they use MCM, because the medical field, they had to do a lot of computer entry and stuff. They started that in the 70s and 80s. There is no mu key on the keyboard. So to type it into the computer, they used MCM instead of just mu M. And then it gets smaller than micro. There's a nanometer, which is a billionth, and a picometer, and femtometer, and so on. Anything smaller than a micrometer is really smaller than what you guys have to deal with. Well, even in the machining class, anything smaller than a micrometer is way too small. Yeah. Around here, most companies around here will machine to 1,000th of an inch, maybe a 10,000th of an inch. There's only one company in the area within about, I used to do a lot of consulting work and quality control stuff. Only one company I know of in about a 100-mile radius of here that machines smaller than that. Hutchinson Technology had some stuff that they were doing down to a millionth of an inch for a while, which is still way bigger than a micrometer. So, or actually, sorry, it's a little bit smaller than a micrometer. So anyway, bigger than a meter, we had Deca. Deca stands for 10. Now, DM was decimeter, so they used DAM for decameter. Then we had hecto, which stood for 100. So a hectometer, or HM, is 100 meters. And then, Jason's favorite, kilo, means 1,000. So km, or kilometer, is 1,000 meters. Kilo, never mind. We'll explain to you later. Bigger than kilo, just like on the other end, they stopped going every 10. They started going by 1,000. So 1 million is mega. Since MM was used for millimeter, they used capital M, little m, for megameter. If you're into computers, you know how this goes. You have kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes would be a billion, or gigameters would be a billion, tera would be a trillion, and so on and so forth. It's the same stuff. The cool thing about the metric system is we don't have to go through all those conversions of multiplying and dividing and stuff. If you look at this chart, moving one spot to the left or right, you're just multiplying or dividing by 10. It's 1/10 or 10 times, right? So when you multiply or divide by 10, all it does to your number is move the decimal point. So anyway, let's say you have 230 or 228 millimeters, and you want to convert it into centimeters. Well, if you look at the chart here, millimeters to centimeters is one spot to the left. Every spot on the chart was multiplying or dividing by 10, which means the decimal point just moves one spot. So 22.8, you got it. So converting in the metric system is just moving a decimal point. So you might have 0.059 meters, and I want to convert that into centimeters. Well, on my table here, from meters to centimeters is 2 spots to the right. I move my decimal point 2 spots to the right. 5.9.
I like that now.
Yeah, see how nice and easy it is? So, I have a packet I'm going to hand out to you, and in my packet, on page 237, I'm going to have you do 1 through 12. All of them, not just the odds. And on page 265, I'm going to have you do 6 through 14. This will be homework. It's a packet. I don't know.